A city sees dust on the horizon. At first it is only movement. Then banners become visible. Then the shape becomes unmistakable. Rome is coming. The gates close. The walls fill with defenders. Grain is counted. Wells are checked. Orders are shouted. And yet, sometimes before the first full assault even begins, before the battering ram strikes, before the ladders rise, before the walls are breached, something extraordinary happens. The gates open, not because the stones failed, because the minds behind the stones failed. That is one of the coldest truths about Roman expansion. Rome did not always conquer cities by smashing them open. Sometimes it conquered them by making resistance feel irrational. By the time the legions stood outside the walls, the real battle had already started inside the city. And that is why this subject matters. Because Rome's greatest siege weapon was often not wood, iron, or fire. It was certainty. When people imagine Roman conquest, they picture disciplined legions, shield walls, siege towers, roads, camps, and catapults. All of that matters. But beneath the machinery was something even more powerful. Rome understood how to manipulate expectation. It understood how to make cities calculate survival in a way that favored surrender. It turned fear, division, rumor, memory, and reputation into weapons. Rome did not just attack walls. Rome attacked decision-making. That is the true psychological tactic. Make the city believe that opening the gates is the least painful future still available. Now that sounds simple, but it was built from several layers, each one reinforcing the others. The first layer was reputation. Reputation is a weapon because it arrives before the army does. A city under threat does not judge Rome only by the soldiers standing outside its walls. It judges Rome by what happened to the last city that resisted, and the city before that, and the one before that. Every surrender, every massacre, every act of mercy, every punishment becomes part of a strategic memory. Rome understood that memory travels faster than soldiers. One city hears that another resisted and was destroyed. Another hears that surrender preserved property and elite status. Another hears that rebels were executed, but those who cooperated kept their lives and influence. Gradually, a mental map forms across the region. Resistance may be honorable, but surrender is survivable. That distinction changes everything, because cities do not make decisions as abstract symbols of courage. They make decisions through real people, elites, merchants, priests, officers, landowners, families, each asking the same question in different ways. What happens to us if we refuse? Rome made sure that question already had an answer before the first ram touched the gate. And the answer was never purely military. It was political and social. Rome did not need every city to admire it. It needed every city to understand consequences. If a city surrendered early, Rome could be pragmatic. It could preserve local leaders, protect trade, confirm privileges, take hostages, and move on. If a city resisted and forced a costly siege, Rome could become terrifying. This was not inconsistency. It was design. Selective mercy and selective brutality are far stronger together than either is alone. Mercy without punishment looks weak. Punishment without mercy creates desperate resistance. When cities see that submission can be rewarded, while stubborn resistance can be annihilated, surrender begins to look like intelligence rather than cowardice. That is how a psychological system is built. Now imagine what this does inside a city council chamber. The Roman army is outside, but the real conflict begins inside. One faction says the walls are strong. Another says Rome will eventually break through. One argues for honor. Another argues for survival. Merchants fear the ruin of trade. Aristocrats fear the loss of status. Common people fear hunger and slaughter. Officers fear betrayal from within. Priests fear desecration. Suddenly the city is fighting itself before it ever fights Rome. This internal fracture is one of Rome's greatest advantages. Because once a city becomes divided over whether resistance is worth the cost, the wall is already weaker than it looks. Walls protect bodies. They do not protect morale, and morale only holds if the people behind the wall still believe the future can improve. Rome attacked that belief. It also attacked it through display. Roman camps were not random collections of tired men. They were statements. Orderly, disciplined, geometric, methodical. The city looking down from the wall did not see a mob. It saw a machine. Straight lines, defensive works, camp routines, rotations, confidence. The message was clear: this is not an army that panics. And this is not an army that leaves quickly. That matters psychologically because defenders are not only calculating strength, they are calculating endurance. A city can outlast a raid. It may not outlast a disciplined enemy that has arrived prepared to stay. Rome was very good at looking inevitable. That may be the most important word of all: inevitable. Cities open their gates when they stop asking, "Can we resist?" and start asking, "How bad will it be when we lose?" That shift from possibility to inevitability is the center of Roman psychological warfare, and Rome encouraged that shift deliberately. How Rome made resistance feel useless. Rome's psychological tactic was not one trick. It was a sequence. That is what made it so powerful. A city did not surrender because of one shouted threat outside the walls. It surrendered because Rome built an entire environment in which resistance began to feel less like bravery and more like a delayed disaster. The first step was isolation. A city is strongest when it believes it still has options. Maybe allies will arrive. Maybe another army will distract Rome. Maybe supplies will last. Maybe the enemy will lose patience and move on. Hope is a military asset. Rome's job was to shrink hope until the city's choices looked smaller every day. That meant controlling roads, blocking approaches, seizing nearby resources, intimidating neighboring communities, and making it clear that help was not coming soon enough to matter. Rome did not always need a perfect encirclement on the first day. It only needed to create the feeling of narrowing futures. Because once a city believes it is alone, fear changes shape. It becomes practical. Now, the elite inside the city begin asking harder questions. How long will grain last? How loyal are the guards? If the walls are breached, who will be blamed? Which families are already preparing secret negotiations? If Rome offers terms now, what can still be saved? How many people inside these walls are secretly ready to open the gates if things become worse? Those are exactly the questions Rome wanted alive. A siege is not only pressure on walls. It is pressure on time. Time is cruel to defenders. Every day of waiting magnifies uncertainty. A city under siege does not face only the enemy outside. It faces erosion inside, food anxiety, disease risk, factional argument, rumor, fatigue, suspicion. The longer the city waits, the more the struggle turns inward. Rome exploited that inward turn. This is where negotiation becomes part of the weapon system. Modern people sometimes imagine negotiation as the opposite of violence. But in Roman strategy, negotiation could be an extension of violence. Rome could offer terms not because it had suddenly become gentle, but because terms forced the city's leaders to compare two futures directly. Future one: surrender now, preserve part of the population, keep some status, perhaps keep property, perhaps keep local leadership under Roman authority. Future two: resist, endure siege, risk famine, risk betrayal, and if the walls fall, lose everything. Once those futures are placed side by side, the city begins to do Rome's work for it. Because not everyone inside values the same thing equally. Merchants value continuity. Aristocrats value rank and estates. Priests value sacred protection. Military leaders value honor but also fear blame. Common people fear hunger and massacre more than political symbolism. Rome understood that a city is never one mind. It is a nervous coalition, and nervous coalitions split under pressure. So Rome did not only attack the city from outside, it tempted internal factions to betray each other's preferred future. This is why hostages, intermediaries, promises, and final chances mattered. They were not minor side notes. They were tools for dividing defenders. If one elite faction began to believe negotiation could preserve its position, then hardline resistance suddenly had enemies inside the walls. Now add the second tool, engineering display. Roman siege warfare was terrifying not only because it was effective, but because it was visible. Defenders could watch the enemy build ramps, towers, trenches, camps, roads, lines of investment, siege engines. Every day, the Romans were outside the wall doing something organized, something methodical, something that implied patience and competence. That visual message was devastating. A chaotic enemy is comforting, because chaos suggests weakness. A systematic enemy is frightening, because system suggests inevitability. When a city looks down and sees not desperation, but process, it begins to realize that Rome did not arrive hoping to get lucky. Rome arrived with a plan. And plans are harder to emotionally resist than rage. This is why Roman siege preparation itself was psychological warfare. Every ditch dug, every tower raised, every line fortified says the same thing. We are not leaving, and we are not improvising. The defenders, meanwhile, can feel their own position changing. They are no longer a city with a wall. They are a city in a countdown. Now we come to the cruelest part of Rome's method, calibrated reputation. Rome did not behave the same way everywhere. That was what made it effective. If every city expected massacre no matter what, then resistance would become rational. A city with nothing to lose fights desperately. Rome preferred cities to feel they still had something to save, if they submitted in time. So Rome made examples selectively. One city that resisted stubbornly could be destroyed so thoroughly that 10 nearby cities would recalculate. Another city that surrendered early might be treated with visible restraint. The contrast between those outcomes was the lesson. Resist late and die. Submit early and survive. That creates a moral trap. Because now defenders are not deciding only between courage and fear. They are deciding between different versions of responsibility. Is it more honorable to resist and risk the death of the population, or to surrender and preserve the city's future under Roman rule? Rome wanted that question to become unbearable. And once it became unbearable, the gates often opened. A wall is not only stone. A wall is a promise. It promises time. It promises protection. It promises that the men on top can keep the enemy below long enough for something to change. Long enough for relief to come, for attackers to weaken, for fortune to shift, for hope to survive. Cities open their gates when that promise dies. Not always in one dramatic instant. More often, it dies slowly, quietly, through hunger, rumor, fear, and the terrible realization that the wall is no longer buying a better future, only delaying a worse one. That is the emotional center of Rome's psychological tactic. Rome did not need every defender to lose courage. It only needed enough people inside the city to lose confidence in the value of resistance. Once that happens, the wall remains physically standing, but politically and psychologically it has already failed. This is why sieges are never only military events. They are social pressure chambers. Inside a besieged city, every ordinary thing becomes political. Bread becomes political. Water becomes political. The opening of a granary becomes political. A rumor about an ally army becomes political. A missing officer becomes political. Every decision begins to divide the city between those who still believe and those who no longer do. Rome understood that the defender's greatest weakness was not always lack of courage. It was lack of unity under prolonged pressure. At the beginning, the mood inside a city can even be confident. The gates are shut. The walls are strong. The enemy is outside. Crowds cheer. Leaders speak of endurance. Resistance seems honorable because the cost still feels abstract. But Rome doesn't attack only with force. Rome attacks with time. Time turns abstract costs into visible costs. Food stocks begin to shrink. Prices rise. Merchants complain. Families start hoarding. Tension grows between civilians and soldiers because soldiers eat first. or are accused of eating too much. Suddenly the city is no longer one body. It is a competition of fears, and fear never stays still. One rumor says a relief army is coming. Another says it was defeated. One says Rome is offering fair terms. Another says Roman siege works will breach the walls in days. One says the elite are preparing to surrender secretly. Another says commanders will kill anyone who speaks of negotiation. Even if none of these rumors are fully true, they still do damage, because rumor erodes trust faster than hunger alone. A city under siege depends on shared belief. If that belief breaks, discipline follows it. Guards begin to doubt commanders. Citizens begin to doubt guards. Leaders begin to watch one another more than they watch the enemy. The city turns inward, and that inward turn is often the beginning of defeat. This is where Rome becomes frighteningly advanced in its understanding of human behavior. Rome does not always need to storm the wall. It can let the city imagine its own collapse. It can let factions exhaust one another. It can let fear multiply inside rooms Romans have never physically entered. And then comes the next stage. Betrayal becomes thinkable. This is the moment every besieged city fears most. Not the breach from outside, the opening from inside. Maybe it is a gatekeeper bribed. Maybe it is an elite faction that decides its future is safer under Roman rule than under local ruin. Maybe it is a commander who no longer believes the wall can hold. Maybe it is civilians who pressure leaders to negotiate before famine or slaughter arrive. It does not matter exactly where the fracture begins. What matters is that once enough influential people inside the city conclude that surrender is the least terrible option, resistance changes from virtue into liability. And that is the moment Rome is waiting for. Because now Rome no longer needs to destroy the city to win it. The city begins to transfer itself. This is why Roman siege warfare was as much about display and endurance as assault. A city that can be broken internally is cheaper to take than a city that must be physically ruined. Rome preferred cheap conquest whenever possible, not because it was merciful, but because intact cities remained valuable. A ruined city is a warning. An intact surrendered city is a tax base. It is a port. It is a road node. It is a future ally under supervision. Rome knew the difference between punishing and harvesting. That is another reason the tactic worked. Rome was not trying to annihilate every city. It was trying to make each city choose the version of defeat most useful to Rome. So, what was the psychological tactic that made cities open their gates to Rome? It was not one speech, not one machine, not one act of cruelty. It was something colder and more powerful. Rome made surrender feel more rational than resistance. That is the full answer. Rome understood that cities do not fall only when walls fail. Cities fall when the people inside stop believing the wall can protect a future worth preserving. Once that belief is gone, stone becomes delay, not defense. And delay is not enough when the enemy outside looks organized, patient, and inevitable. That is why Rome's greatest siege weapon was often certainty. Rome arrived with a reputation that had already begun the battle. The city knew what happened to those who resisted too long. It also knew that early surrender could preserve life, status, and property. That contrast mattered. Rome was not random, and that made it more frightening. A random enemy produces chaos. A predictable enemy produces calculation. And calculation is what opens gates. Because once the city begins calculating, courage stops being pure. It becomes entangled with food, family, status, and blame. A merchant asks how long trade can survive. A landowner asks whether his estate will still exist if the city is stormed. A priest asks whether temples will be spared. A commander asks whether he can still trust the men under him. A politician asks whether surrender today preserves more than resistance tomorrow. Rome wanted all of those questions alive at once. It wanted the city to become a court case against itself. Then Rome added pressure in layers. First, isolation. The city begins to feel alone. Relief is uncertain. Roads are cut, allies are silent, time narrows, then display. The Roman camp outside the walls looks disciplined, methodical, permanent. Defenders do not see desperation. They see a machine. Then negotiation. Terms are offered, not as kindness, but as architecture. A choice is made: visible surrender now, and preserve something, or resist and risk everything. Then memory. The city remembers what happened elsewhere, not only to those who fought bravely, but to those who surrendered early and survived. And finally, time. Time is Rome's invisible ally because time turns uncertainty into exhaustion. Hunger rises, rumor spreads, factions sharpen, betrayal becomes imaginable. The city begins to collapse inward. That is the system. That is the tactic. And that is why it worked so often. Because Rome did not ask the city, "Are you brave?" Rome asked the city, "Are you prepared to lose more than we are?" That question is devastating, because many cities were not built to answer it for long. A city can withstand an assault for a day through adrenaline and honor. It is much harder to withstand certainty for weeks. Certainty destroys from the inside. It makes people imagine the end before the end arrives. It forces them to compare futures. And once the least terrible future becomes surrender, the wall has already been defeated. This is also why Rome's selective mercy and selective brutality mattered so much. If Rome destroyed every city, no matter what, defenders would have no reason not to fight desperately. But if Rome made it clear that obedience could preserve life, while stubborn resistance could invite annihilation, then every city became its own strategist. Rome outsourced part of the siege to the enemy's own mind. The defenders argued, divided, weakened one another's resolve, and turned opening the gates from shame into necessity. Once necessity becomes the dominant language inside a city, surrender is no longer a collapse of courage. It becomes an act of preservation. That is how Rome won without always breaching. It changed the moral meaning of the decision. And that is why cities opened their gates. Not because the walls were weak, but because Rome made the people behind the walls believe that keeping them closed no longer made sense.